people were experiencing an epidemic back then, it would also explain why the disciples had left Jesus to run off and stock up on food, wouldn't it? It would further explain why Jesus refused their food when they returned to him, saying, "I have food that you do not know about." Wait, Jesus hoarding food? Wait, at least the disciples did not have to worry about buying toilet paper back then. Throughout human history, outbreaks of new diseases have arisen in various corners of the world and spread everywhere else. It just happens faster now. The most recent epidemic arose over the past couple months. A novel coronavirus, which began as an outbreak in Wuhan, China, and spread until it was considered an epidemic. The World Health Organization defines an epidemic as a sudden increase in the number of cases of a disease above what is normally expected in a particular population. And I actually have a picture of this. See how this works on Facebook live streaming. This is a picture of perhaps a typical amount of disease. It goes up and down, etc. And then an epidemic is when that level of disease goes beyond what is considered typical or normal. In this case, the world had not known of this particular version of the coronavirus, this particular kind. It's a new kind, and so really anything above nothing is a risk of an epidemic. A pandemic, then, is a kind of epidemic that spreads over several countries or continents and affects a large number of people. So this novel coronavirus disease of 2019, named COVID-19 for short, or SARS-CoV-2, which is its technical name, it was classified as a pandemic this past Wednesday by the World Health Organization because it had spread across 6 continents and 100 countries, and because there is no antibiotic or medicine that can treat it. Over time, it is also possible that COVID-19 will shift from being an epidemic to being endemic within the human population around the world. Something becomes endemic when there is observed an ongoing transmission of the disease year after year, much like the flu and other versions of the coronavirus, which we know as the common cold. At the moment, we are not meeting in person as the church because we are seeking to keep the virus from infecting so many people that we could potentially overwhelm our healthcare system to the point where it could not keep up, as has been in the case in other parts of the world recently. To help keep this from happening, President Trump declared a national emergency on Friday, which finally then stabilized the ongoing meltdown that had been taking place in the stock market out of fear of the impact the virus would have on global life and the economy as we know it. Now, on the one hand, the anxiety has seemed appropriate. Healthcare leaders and financial executives were all concerned that cases of this novel coronavirus not grow so fast that it overwhelm our healthcare system and other institutions as it has in other places, like Wuhan, China, Italy, and elsewhere. On the other hand, every year, the seasonal flu kills anywhere between 290,000 to 650,000 people worldwide, including somewhere between 12,000 and 61,000 people in the United States alone. According to Aaron Sorrell, assistant research professor in the Department of Microbiology and Immunology at Georgetown University, people are much more comfortable with something that is well understood and predictable, even if it's hard. She says, people tolerate the risk of exposure to seasonal flu. We're comparing a risk tolerance of something new and novel and not well understood versus something we see year after year. Our own reactions, the anxiety we may feel ourselves or in our families, are a reminder that human beings have evolved in such a way that novel threats, like the novel coronavirus, evoke much more anxiety than ongoing threats, those to which we have become accustomed, even when they're hard. And our anxiety about the unknown can sometimes evoke strange behavior in us, which can be kind of humorous to watch in ourselves and to watch in others. It was this past Monday that I first drove through a Fred Meyer grocery store parking lot and noticed a woman walking out of the store, walking home, carrying 6 big bags of toilet paper. It was the first I'd even thought about toilet paper. Wait a minute, what am I missing? Do I need toilet paper? I thought. I didn't get any that day. By the time I started thinking more about toilet paper later in the week, it was gone. Lots of people are obsessing about toilet cleaner and hand sanitizer and Lysol disinfectant and bleach these days, and there's not enough to go around. We could not function if our limbic systems had to stay on alert to everything that is a threat all the time, and so we acclimate to ongoing risks such as heart disease, cancer, dying from a car accident, and these risks are really significant, actually. I had a chart for that one, too. Let's see. Yeah. Here it is. This is a chart of death rates in the United States from various kinds of factors from the year 1900 up until, this is 1998 actually, and you'll see that flu pandemic of 1918 right here. But other than that, you'll see that the biggest risk factor here, this purple one, is from heart disease. And I wonder if early in this century, if people probably considered the rise of heart disease to be a growing epidemic, because look how it kept shooting up and up and up, but then finally it kind of starts leveling off and we just start to consider heart disease as being endemic within our society. Also cancer, here's the yellow line for cancer, goes up, probably felt like an epidemic as cancer was going up, until it starts to level off also and become something endemic that we're used to. If you take the totality of all of these risk factors, it is much bigger of a death rate than an epidemic that we are facing right now, or a pandemic. We have evolved to become very anxious around new threats, especially those that come with real risks to health, society, and economy, if we don't work together to flatten the curve of infections, as many people have been reminding us. Mental health professionals are already experiencing an epidemic of anxiety around the coronavirus. Many people who already struggle with anxiety are struggling even more right now, especially because typical strategies that they're encouraged to do, like reach out for support to the community, those strategies aren't as readily accessible while we are being told to engage in social distancing. Dawn Brown is the helpline director for the National Alliance on Mental Illness, where they are seeing a spike in phone calls. She identified the most vulnerable as being those with obsessive compulsive disorder and anxiety, those who suffer from schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. She says they are at greater risk of acquiring the virus, as well as having poor outcomes if they do. They're often overrepresented in the homeless population or have unstable housing. Also incarcerated people because they lack treatment facilities. The close proximity those populations find themselves in make it a perfect storm, she says, for coronavirus spread. Precisely because of factors like this, it is essential that faith communities and other social purpose organizations step up our efforts right now, rather than going on break during this time. It's a privilege if we are not under undue stress during a time of global pandemic and economic slowdown. Back to the Bible passage for today. It sure would explain a lot if this woman who came to the well alone at such an odd time of day had come because she was reacting to an epidemic. That would mean that there was a rapid spread of a new threat in her community and would explain her behavior. But there's no textual evidence in this Bible passage for the existence of a new threat. It is far more likely that her reason for being at the well in the middle of the day was due to an existing endemic threat, which then, as now, often presents the greater ongoing risk, danger, or harm. What kinds of existing threats are endemic and present significant threats to many? Discrimination, racism, poverty, and a world in which the rich keep getting richer and the poor keep getting poorer. Those are all examples of existing endemic threats. Climate change feels like an endemic threat, even though it is probably a pandemic that is already causing a much, much greater threat to human life and all life on Earth than this novel coronavirus will, even though the novel coronavirus is significant. And I'm in no way trying to minimize the fact that the novel coronavirus poses a serious risk. It is just that we need to attend to epidemic threats like this as they emerge while simultaneously working to interrupt the endemic patterns within our societies that pose the greatest threat over time and which are often being magnified during times of epidemics. This Bible story points to endemic discrimination, which this woman suffered on multiple intersecting levels. Because her pain came from endemic discrimination, I doubt anybody in her community even really thought about it anymore. Why she wasn't there when the other woman went to the well early in the morning? Why she always went alone, isolating herself from a community that had probably pushed her away? The community probably just acclimated to that distance and accepted that her situation was the way it was and didn't really consider it or look at it more closely than that. Similarly, the Jewish disciples who accompanied Jesus on this journey accepted the ingrained animosity and distrust that existed between their people and her people, the people of Samaria. After all, that's just how it was, and it had been that way for a long, long time. In a February 20th article titled, "The World in the Grips of an Epidemic More Dangerous Than Coronavirus," Hamid Dabashi pointed out that, according to PBS, restaurants in South Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, and Vietnam had refused to accept Chinese customers. Indonesians marched near a hotel and called on Chinese guests there to leave. French and Australian newspapers faced criticism for racist headlines. Chinese and other Asians in Europe, the United States, Asia, and the Pacific complain of racism. The author points out the foolishness of this approach because pandemics have begun in nearly every corner of the world throughout history. He says, as health officials in China and around the world seek to prevent the spread of this virus, the rest of us must prevent the spread of the racist condition of fear of the foreigner, which predates and shall outlive this outbreak, he says. Although neither Jesus nor this woman needed to worry about COVID-19, Jesus was truly at risk of becoming unclean by even talking with this woman, let alone touching her cup or bucket. As a man, the only woman Jesus should have ever been talking to in public alone were women from his own family. The risk posed by this conversation to each of them were tremendous. Remember that Samaritans were considered by Jesus' Jewish people to be half-breeds, and Jews would go to great lengths to avoid them, even going all the way around around Samaria when they had to travel in order to avoid having to interact with a single Samaritan. These Samaritans, considered half-breeds, that had arisen after the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel to Assyria. The Assyrian king brought people from 5 different conquered regions and settled them there in Samaria. It was an intentional practice of cultural genocide, much like was done to Native Americans in our own country when they were pressured to marry people who were not Native American, so that over time the United States government could come up with an excuse to terminate every tribe and not have to honor U.S. treaty obligations with them. So this Samaritan woman's ancestors were those Jews who had remained there in the northern kingdom who had intermarried with those people the Assyrian government brought in from other regions to inhabit this land. Samaritans like her had some Jewish customs from their Jewish ancestors and some customs and religious practices which their other ancestors from other places had brought with them when they were resettled in that northern kingdom. Many of these other practices were considered to be idolatry to Jews like Jesus and his disciples. So this woman is understandably surprised that Jesus would not only ask her for a drink, but also be willing to touch and drink out of her cup, and then go on to have a theological, a spiritual conversation with her. We can only begin to understand the number of barriers the two of them were breaking by simply talking together. There's no basis for believing that this woman or her people were suffering from an epidemic, but it is quite possible she was suffering from prejudice, assumptions, and discrimination of her own people due to the fact that, as Jesus rightly named, she had had 5 husbands and now was living with one who was not her husband. This caused a lot of social isolation for her. Perhaps many of us previously heard and believed that this woman was promiscuous or a prostitute. If so, then we might realize how truly endemic discrimination against women and people considered foreigners is within human society, even 2,000 years later. Luther Seminary professor David Lose, previously he was the professor at Luther Seminary, and while he wrote an article challenging preachers to see that there is no solid basis for this assumption. He says, she is not a prostitute. She doesn't have a shady past. Jesus at no point invites repentance, or for that matter, speaks of sin at all. She very easily could have been widowed, or have been abandoned or divorced, which in the ancient world was pretty much the same for a woman. 5 times would be heartbreaking, but not impossible, he says. Further, she could now be living with someone that she was dependent on, or be in what's called a levirate marriage, where a childless woman is married to her deceased husband's brother in order to produce an heir, yet is not always technically considered the brother's wife. There are any number of ways, in fact, that one might imagine this woman's story as tragic rather than scandalous. Yet most preachers assume the latter, he says. Many other professors agree with Professor Lose's interpretation of this passage. We really don't know if this woman's previous marriages ended by death or divorce, but based upon the clues that the Gospel of John so carefully gives us, we can safely assume that she carried with her a lot of grief, and in this culture, a ton of shame. I have no husband, she said. Jesus says, you are right in saying I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true. Instead of shaming her, Jesus moves in closer and welcomes her to name what is real. She accepts the invitation and holds her own as a theological conversation partner with Jesus. In the process, she becomes the lead disciple among the Samaritan people. Whatever shame she had felt due to the forces of prejudice or sexism or discrimination within her own culture, through this conversation with Jesus, she was suddenly free to seek out those townspeople whom she had been avoiding, to share with them the truth of what had happened to her. And her story and her witness led them to a deeper life and a deeper faith as well. Although human beings seem to be wired to sometimes overreact to epidemics while underreacting to the threats posed by endemic physical or societal illnesses, Jesus never did. He saw clearly the pain of those whose suffering or exclusion people had simply become accustomed to, and he would have none of it. Time and time again, he reached out and risked ritual uncleanliness, social infection, or economic marginalization in order to restore others to wholeness, the fullness of life, and authentic community. I ran across this graph this week of real societal challenges that took place during the 20th century, which resulted in significant declines in infectious disease mortality in the United States over the past 100 years or so. This is what it looks like. It used to be that the rate of about 800 deaths, right here, 800 deaths per 100,000 people was the endemic rate from all infectious diseases. But beginning with the institution of 40 state health departments, like here, followed by adding chlorine to public water systems and the use of penicillin and other antibiotics, the rate decreased down to here, less than 100 deaths per 100,000. And it occurred to me that it is with this kind of a vision that God in Jesus sees the community of life on earth. Whereas we are often inclined to underestimate or acclimate to the endemic patterns within our human societies that continue to cause great harm to so many, God does not. Jesus would not settle for less than the full welcome of the whole person to the entire community. When people catch this vision through their own encounter with Jesus or through a different faith tradition even, it draws out another impulse within us that is also truly part of who we are and who we have evolved to be. I felt that spirit when a man came out of a storeroom in the back of the Fred Meyer grocery store where I didn't get toilet paper, but there was a man, a father and his son, who I could tell from their voices were immigrants from Africa. This man came out of the back storeroom with a big package of toilet paper for them, and I swear it was as if they had won the lottery. They were laughing and giddy with excitement, and I was the one who came walking down the aisle, and they just wanted to show me, and I couldn't help but be so happy for them. He told me, "We are going to make this last all month," he said.